Hello and welcome to the video on Intro to Nutrition. This will just give you a general overview of some of the nutritional topics that we'll talk about in the chapter on digestion. These topics are things that ultimately influence many of the different features of a healthy organism. So that's part of why this is a topic that we're talking about in human biology. When it comes to digestion, the nutrition that we're getting from our food is the most important aspect of that. So to get started with this one, the first thing to talk about is that the definition of nutrition is the absorption of nutrients from food. So the purpose is to absorb those nutrients into the body. We'll talk about like the different steps of digestion that allow for that to happen, and then how those nutrients are distributed throughout the body in various processes. A lot of that ties into things that we'll talk about with the circulatory system. But nutrients are essential substances that the body needs. So there's a variety of things that we need. We'll talk about water and our water needs. We'll talk about the vitamins that we need. So many of those vitamins are things that you can only get from foods directly. There are other things that are a little bit more environmental, like vitamin D. But for the most part, like the vitamins are coming from our food. The ions and electrolytes. So you think of things like potassium and sodium as important things that are coming there. That's a topic that'll carry over for us into a couple of different sections. Like we'll talk about that with muscular function, with nervous system function, with cardiac function. So that there's a lot of overlap with some of these nutritional topics and into other things that we'll talk about later on in the class. We have the three major macromolecule groups there, right? So the carbohydrates, which we'll talk about these more in nutrition and like the different categories of carbohydrates. So there's like simple and complex carbohydrates. So the way that they're treated in the body is a little bit different. We'll talk about the response that you get from insulin when like blood sugar is high and how blood sugar is regulated once we get to the endocrine system. So this is another topic from nutrition that carries over for us. For lipids, like things like fats and cholesterols are actually very important for hormone function. So hormones are derived from lipids. They're like different categories of lipids. So the lipids from food is ultimately where a lot of that's coming from. And then the final one are proteins. Proteins are responsible for many different signals in the body. They're also the structural component of what we see for like tendons and ligaments and muscles. So we'll spend some time talking about like different protein sources, the amino acid composition of proteins, and how you can get protein from a lot of different sources. It doesn't have to be animal sources, but you do need to strive for what's called a complete protein source. So not to get too much into like what we'll be talking about further along, but there's different amino acids that compose proteins. Some of those amino acids are called essential amino acids. These are the ones that the body cannot formulate on its own. They're ones that you have to get from dietary consumption. So as long as we're getting a complete amino acid profile, then you can be healthy. And so you can certainly manage that even without consuming animal products. You just have to be mindful of your protein sources and make sure you're pairing things up that are complementary to each other. So we'll spend more time talking about that certainly as we work our way through this unit. But the key to all of this, I guess, is balance, right? So the balanced diet is going to contain all the different nutrients that are necessary to maintain homeostasis. Think about those three main food groups that were back there. We had carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Anytime people are talking about a dietary strategy that eliminates an entire macronutrient food group, that is something that's typically not going to lead to healthy outcomes, right? So all of those things are important in their own way, and even though, like for example, carbohydrates, like there's no essential carbohydrate. If you're very very low in carbohydrates, it can push you into a process called ketosis, which is one of the things that we'll talk about as we work our way through this unit. So people can certainly be in ketosis and be healthy, but there's just things to be aware of when it comes to like eliminating entire food groups. And something, I guess my personal bias on it is that if you're eliminating a food group, it's probably going to make it difficult to maintain that style of eating. So I think it's a better overall approach to have more of a balanced diet. But then the state of malnutrition down below is an unhealthy state resulting in the inadequate intake of nutrients. So this could be the missing of any of the major nutrients we were talking about there. It could be a vitamin deficiency, it could be a mineral deficiency, could just be a caloric deficiency, right, where someone's not getting enough calories in their diet. So we'll talk about some of the different things that could result from malnutrition, and then things that could potentially cause malnutrition. To just go through these briefly, and you've probably had this kind of thing in like a health class before, right? But we'll talk about some of the different categories for foods. So for dairy, things like milk and yogurt and cheese, there's certainly a lot of valuable things that you can get from those kinds of products. So protein is a variety of different sources. I was saying to you, it doesn't have to be meat, but obviously that's one that is a complete protein because it's coming from other animals. So it's a complete protein source. So are eggs. Nuts are a good protein source, also a good source of healthy fats, right? But then there's many other protein sources. So you think of things like legumes and peas and those kinds of things that are actually very high in protein as well. Vegetables, right, we'll discuss a lot of the advantages to the nutritional aspect of vegetables. Fruit consumption. Fruit's actually pretty high in carbohydrates, but there's a lot of other valuable things in there. So like you get a lot of fiber from vegetables and fruits, and even though fiber is a type of carbohydrate that the body doesn't absorb and use for energy, it's very helpful digestionally. And we'll talk about some of the advantages of that and like why fiber is important, even though it basically just like passes through the body. So like soluble and insoluble fiber, and we'll talk about some of those differences. But carbohydrates, you could go on and on about the carbohydrate list there, but like bread, cereals, rices, pastas, all those kinds of things under the carbohydrate category. As I mentioned to you, fruits would certainly fall under there as well. So I don't want you to think that all of the carbohydrates are things that are necessarily like processed. Rice on the list there isn't processed, but all those other foods would be things that people are making. Certainly, fruits are very high in carbohydrates. So like that's something I guess to consider is a lot of these categories, like there's things that would cross over between them, right? So like depending on the kind of meat you're eating and under protein, like that could be potentially very high in fat also. So it's not that the things that are on this list are solely the category in which they're listed. They would sort of like float between multiple categories, but that would be like the primary nutritional aspect of the foods. But then the last one under fats, we're talking about like oils and sweets. This kind of comes off of the stereotypical food pyramid. That's where I got most of these things from because I figured that's something that you've seen before. Fats, as far as oils go, those are generally probably not the best options depending on where it's coming from. So things like vegetable oil are not necessarily ideal, but more healthy fats. So if you're thinking of like things like olive oil, that's certainly a better option. But there's fats that are very important in our diet for healthy hormone function. So the thing I guess to keep in mind is there are no good or bad categories here. It's all about maintaining balance, maintaining that balanced, healthy diet. So we'll talk about the things that are valuable in each of these categories, and then just the things to be aware of. So everything here has like nutritional advantages, but if you eat too much or too many of one thing in some of these categories, it can be detrimental. So the theme, I think, for a lot of the nutritional discussion that we'll have will be balance. And I do think that kind of thing is generally sensible. And I'll try to back that up with you when it comes to more of the information we're talking about in class. So I see this one's getting a little bit longer, approaching 9.5 minutes. So we'll sort of stop this here. I'm certainly interested in talking to you more about some of these topics when I see you in class. So make sure you use your notes to answer the questions at the end, and we'll discuss this one later. Thank you.